Hello, hello, hello. I am live all the way from Ottawa. Well, almost Ottawa. I live close to Ottawa. I live in a small city that's just on the outskirts of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. My name is Linda. I'm your Back in the Groove Again coach with another video on my series, What I Wish I Knew Back Then. Now, if anybody's watching, I'd love to know who's joining me today. I started this series last week, or maybe it was this week, I can't remember. And I thought there's so many things that I wish I would have known back then. Because although I don't regret anything that I've done in the past because they've all shaped me to become who I am today. But there are definitely some things that I probably would have done differently or viewed, from a different perspective. And the one thing that I want to talk more about today is relationships. Now, first, I'm going to talk about my background. My friend and I chatted yesterday, and she actually thought that I was actually where it looks like I am. Now, it was a different picture. Hi, who's viewing me? Nice of you to join me. You could type your name in the chat box if you'd like. So my friend thought that I was actually at the Parc de Moulins because the picture behind me was from the park. But I told her, no, I have a green screen. So I'm not really in outer space. I know it kind of sounds weird. Please type your name in the chat box. I'd love to say hi to you. So today I'm talking about relationships. Now, I might have shared in previous videos that I've been married a few times. I'm not going to talk about marriages right now, but I've been married a few times and I've had different types of relationships over the last, decades. Not so much in the last few years, but many relationships in my 20s and 30s and 40s. And some of the things that I wish I would have known back then, I'm going to give you some examples. I remember one time I was, I was with my boyfriend at the time, and we were visiting in his apartment. And I had a feeling that maybe I didn't want to be there. And this feeling had been there for a while. And it was not only there during that time, but it had been there during different times in our relationship. So one of the things that I wish I would have known back then is that that feeling that I was experiencing was actually my instinct, my gut. And it was actually telling me not to be there. So I wish I would have paid more attention to my gut. I wish I would have paid attention more to my instincts back then, because I probably would have prevented a lot of pain, not just my pain, but the other person's pain as well. And I would have prevented a lot of stress from happening when really it didn't have to happen. I found that a lot of times I was in the wrong relationships for all the wrong reasons. So had I paid attention to that instinct feeling, to the gut feeling, I probably would have prevented a lot of that from happening. So that's one thing that I learned back then, that I wish I would have known back then. That now, I have to say that now, I definitely, and I've been doing this for a while now, I pay attention to that gut. When something tells me something's right, or not right, I pay attention to that now. The other thing that I wish I would have known back then is learning to manage my stress better. Now, back then, this is going to sound really strange, I was teaching stress management. So, I knew the theory and I was practicing some of the practical tips that I was sharing with my participants. But there's so much to stress management that I didn't know. And part of that is really perception, right? How we perceive the situation and how to change our perception. I didn't know that back then. But what I do remember is when I felt stress, I would go into my room and I would work on some crafts. I would concentrate on the crafts, and that allowed me to kind of distract myself from the situation that was happening. Now, I wish I would have known back then to communicate more effectively with the partner that I had. I didn't know how to communicate. I didn't know how to manage conflict. And I'm not talking about argument, because in fact, this person that I was with at the time we were living together, he wasn't a bad person. He was actually a good guy. He had a great sense of humor, and he was open to me doing my own stuff, although at the time I didn't. I got all stressed out when I think if I would have changed that, if I would have managed my stress differently, and if I would have communicated with him very differently, it would have prevented a lot of inner turmoil, my inner turmoil. So that was another thing. I wish I would have learned back then how to manage my stress differently and how to communicate differently. And one more thing that I want to share with you, another thing that I learned back then, especially when I was in relationships, and most of the time, whether it was marriages or other types of relationships, I always thought that they meaning the men in my life, created my happiness. I relied on them always to bring happiness to me. And that's who I was back then, right? I didn't understand that happiness is an inner thing, that happiness is something that I can actually develop on my own, that I don't have to rely on external sources. But one thing that definitely didn't contribute to that. Hello, who's joining me? Thanks for joining me. Thanks for viewing my live. And if you're not viewing it live, I know you are, but if you're viewing this after it's recorded, please do write your comments in the chat box. Who is viewing me now? Please write your name in the chat box. I'd love to say hi. So I was talking about another thing that I learned that I wish I would have known back then was to take time for me, because every time I was in a relationship at the time, I lost me, always. Whether it was a marriage or it was another relationship, I always forgot about me and put all of my attention on the other person. Again, I was sharing earlier that I thought it was the other person that had to bring me happiness, instead of me finding happiness, discovering what makes me happy, taking time for me to discover what I love. I didn't do that back then. So that's a thing that I wish I would have known back then, is that I need to know who I am first before engaging in a relationship. So I'd love to hear what you think about that. What do you think of that? Those tips that I've shared with you. I shared 3 different tips. I shared that I wish I would have known to pay attention more to my inner voice, my instinct. That was the first thing that I wish I would have known back then. The other thing that I shared was I wish I would have known how to manage my stress better and how to communicate better to my partners or husbands. And of course, the last tip that I shared was I wish I would have taken time for me to get to know who I was, who I am, before getting into another relationship. And I'm wondering, what would you say is something that you wish you would have learned back then? You can type a few things in the chat box as well. I'm really curious. And thank you for listening to my live today. I'm going to be ending in just a few minutes, but it would be great to know who's listening to me right now. All right. So I certainly hope that you're taking advantage of what I'm sharing, because honestly, these are things that if I would have known back then, my life could have been very different. Now, no regrets. I believe that everything that I've gone through in relationships, because that's what I'm focusing on now, everything that I've gone through, I've had to go through. I've had to learn these lessons in order to become the woman that I am today. But there are certain things that I could have done differently. That's for sure. That would have changed my relationships, my perception of the relationships as well. So that's it for today's live. Now, I want to also share that I am going to be introducing a 5-day challenge. It's called Take Time for You Now Challenge. I'm going to be launching it in just a few more weeks. So stay tuned for more information about this really interesting challenge. All right, everybody. I'm looking forward to reading your comments about this live, and I will see you next week for my next of the series of What I Wish I Would Have Known Then. Bye-bye now. Have a great day.